Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 6 of my Kobolds and Catacombs card review, and this is probably the craziest set of cards I have ever reviewed in all of Hearthstone. There are 3 new Legendaries here, 2 of which are just absolutely mind-blowingly bonkers, ridiculous. Shenanigans are going to ensue in Kobolds and Catacombs. There's no doubt about that after seeing these cards. So, up first, I'll be doing my detailed reviews. If you don't have a ton of time, if you just want to see these cards, of course, you can hit the link in the description to skip to my quick reviews where I just rate these from 1 to 5 stars. But I hope you'll hang out right now and jump into some of the wildest and wackiest cards Hearthstone has ever imagined in my detailed reviews. Up first, we have the new Priest Legendary Minion, which is one of the craziest cards I think we've ever seen in Hearthstone. This is Temporus, a 7-mana 6/6 dragon with the battle cry that reads, your opponent takes 2 turns, and then you take 2 turns. So essentially the way this works is exactly like a quest mage completing their quest. You play Temporus, you hit the end turn button, then your opponent gets a normal turn, but instead of an end turn button, they have an extra turn button. So they play out, let's say 7 or 8 mana worth of stuff, hit the extra turn button. Any minions they played, of course, now are in an attacking phase because it's a new turn. And then they also get another 8 or 9 mana to play with as well, and then play out those things. So they get 2 turns, and then things are passed back to you, and of course the exact same thing happens, and you now get 2 turns. So you get, presumably, 10, 20 mana to deal with the stuff that they have now dumped onto the board. So there's this really interesting back and forth, this sort of gambit you're making with Temporus where you say, okay, take 2 turns, try to kill me, try to set up some insurmountable board position, try to win the game, essentially, in these next 2 turns. Because if you don't accomplish enough or don't do enough during your 2 turns, believe me, my deck is built in a way that I'm going to take advantage of it. So for instance, the idea with Temporus might be something like setting up a Divine Spirit Inner Fire combo. Because of course, the one risk of Divine Spirit Inner Fire is that if you don't already have an attacking minion on board, you kind of have to throw your buffs out there and just hope they survive or hope that minion lives through the turn. There's not some sort of Vile Spine or Silence out there waiting to remove all your buffs. But with Temporus and the ability to take 2 turns immediately, you can play out a minion and then buff it to the 9s in 1 turn, hit that extra turn button, and then it's immediately ready to attack. So you can get like that guaranteed 40-40 every time as long as you have your combo pieces in hand. And that's the dream, right? Is Temporus basically sets up some sort of 2-turn combo kill. Where you say, okay, even if my opponent plays taunts, maybe I have some silences, maybe I have some board clears, I'm going to have the mana necessary over 2 turns to deal with any defensive tools they set up, and then just kill them using my combo. The risk, obviously, the counter side there, is that there's a good chance your opponent can just kill you if you give them 2 turns in a row. Many decks have that capability. If you think about like aggro decks in particular, they might just be able to pump out enough damage that you can't stay safe. Things like Bloodlust, for instance, become incredible when your opponent has 2 turns, 1 to build the board and then 1 to leverage that board. The double Bloodlust could occasionally just slam you in the face. So you have to play Temporus in a pretty safe state, I think, for it to make a lot of sense. You can't play Temporus with like 5 health. Obviously, that's going to get you killed. They'll just play any 5 attack minion and then just wreck you. So you need to play them with, pretty high health total, maybe a taunt or 2 on board. Otherwise, the risks might be too high. Although I do have to say, I don't think most decks are really capable of killing like a 30 or even 25 health opponent with only 2 turns. Like, you're just giving them sort of 1 guaranteed attack phase. If they have a couple minions on board, they might get a couple attack phases in. But most of the time, that's probably going to be like 10 to 15 damage. Like, it's going to be a lot. It's going to be enough to lose you the game if you don't recover or don't pull off some sort of 2-turn kill combo yourself. But it's not necessarily enough to deny you that opportunity to pull off your 2-turn combo. So, Temporus is like the ultimate risk-reward card. That's something I talk about in my reviews a lot. Like, is he worth the risk? Is the reward enough? Like, this guy takes that to the extremes. Incredibly high risk, but also just a stupidly strong reward. And I kind of think sometimes it could work. I gotta be honest. I think the likelihood of you dying after playing Temporus is on the smaller side. Like, I think that's a 30% occurrence, and living through this opportunity is like a 70% occurrence, depending on the meta right now. Clearly, things could shift. There could be more combos, more opportunities in the future. The meta could always change to make that number move around a little bit. It might not be worth the risk as far as the reward for Temporus is concerned. But the way I see things right now, the way I see things shaping up at the moment, I think it is, and I think this is a card that somebody might be able to build a halfway viable deck around. I don't know that this fits in just every version of Dragon Priest. If you don't have some guaranteed way to leverage that 2-turn opportunity into the biggest swing of your life or just an instant kill, Temporus seems awfully risky. But remember, he is also just a 6/6 minion, so like, if your opponent if they're not going to win the game, if they're getting their 2 turns but realize they can't kill you, they probably have to trade into this 6/6 minion too, so it's not like you're completely wasting that 7 mana. You're getting a solid body out of it, so I think there's enough here that works that this card might just see play. I don't think it's going to be meta-defining or like the tier 1 priest deck by any means, but I think you can build a kind of a combo dragon deck here that does some cool stuff. And we've already seen like mid-rangey dragon decks right now already running Divine Spirit and Inner Fire, and it feels like Temporus could just be a pretty solid inclusion there, or something you get off Netherspite Historian occasionally to set up some big plays. So the mere fact that this card exists, even if you don't necessarily run it in your own Dragon Priest deck, could be game-changing for that deck anyway. So I absolutely love this card. I really like the strategic implications and the kind of gameplay this encourages. Like, it's all in. It's like, take the ultimate risk and see if it pans out for you, see if it works out for you. I don't think that's going to be destructive or frustrating to play against necessarily, because it's like your opponent's giving you all the opportunity and the initiative in the world to win. If you can't leverage that, you maybe didn't deserve to win in the first place. So I think this is an A+ card. I don't necessarily think it's a 5-star card. I just really like the design, and I just can't wait to see this thing in action. It's going to be a lot of fun. So if you thought Temporus was crazy, my next card might somehow be even crazier. I think it's debatable. This is King Togwaggle, a new neutral legendary minion. He's an 8-mana 5/5 with the battle cry that reads, swap decks with your opponent and then give them a ransom spell to swap back. And you can see the King's Ransom there on the right is the spell you give your opponent. It's a 5-mana spell that allows you to swap back decks with your opponent. So this operates exactly as it reads. When you play this, you take your deck and you put it in your opponent's slot. You take your opponent's deck and you put it in your slot. So as soon as you hit the end turn button and pass it back, the first card they draw will essentially be a card from your deck. And then they'll have a choice. Do they want to continue playing with the cards in their hand and potentially the new card from your deck, or do they want to immediately swap back? They essentially have to pay 5 mana if they want to swap back. So, I mean, theoretically, right, if this worked the way you wanted it to work and your opponent said, like, crap, I'm not playing with this dude's deck, I don't know what this is all about, I gotta pay this ransom and get it back, then King Togwaggle is essentially a sort of 3-mana 5/5, right? Because your opponent wastes 5 mana to do nothing, and you got a 5/5 then for essentially kind of a 3-mana swing, right? Because they also spent 5 mana and accomplished nothing with their turn. So it's kind of a delayed 3-mana 5/5 in some ways. Presumably they'd have at least 3 or 4 mana to deal with the remaining King Togwaggle as well. But the problem with that equation essentially is that you're giving your opponent all of the decision making here. You're kind of just playing an 8-mana 5/5, which is clearly a completely understated minion, and then you're giving them the decision to wait. They don't have to switch decks right away. They can just play the cards that were already in their hand, deal with your Togwaggle, which was a pretty weak 8-mana play, and then gain some other sort of advantage, just Bone Mare and trade through it, whatever it might be. Continue to execute the game plan they had in their hand. And then once they've sufficiently gained an advantage from your really weak turn 8 King Togwaggle, they pass it back to you, and now you're left with a new card from your opponent's deck that simply doesn't synergize with your hand. It doesn't do the sorts of things that you need it to do most likely. It's unlikely that you draw exactly the Shadow Reaper Anduin that first turn. So basically, you're giving your opponent kind of a turn or two opportunity to really gain an advantage when you play King Togwaggle. You're just giving them the control, the initiative, the power in the situation, and you're leaving yourself kind of in their hands. So it's an incredibly risky thing to do. And then you might just fall behind over the next turn or two, and then they decide to King's Ransom anyway and switch back, and you haven't actually accomplished anything. You've maybe stolen a couple cards out of their game plan, but it's not like you're going to reliably disrupt their combos or anything like that. So I think it's pretty clear that this is not a competitive tier card. I just don't think it makes sense in that regard. Really good Hearthstone is typically about executing your own game plan, not trying to disrupt your opponents, because that way it's more reliable and more consistent, particularly in a ladder style environment. So King Togwaggle, one of the most absurd cards, looks like a ton of fun. Like, I'm obviously going to be building a deck with this card and trying to do silly things. I can't wait to, in fact. I'm glad this card exists, but not something I would ever expect to see in, for instance, a Hearthstone tournament, or really even a Tier 1 ladder deck, or even a Tier 4 ladder deck. I think King Togwaggle will pretty quickly fall out of the playable ranks of Hearthstone cards and remain little more than a meme, although one of the memeiest memes we've ever had in Hearthstone, no doubt, for King Togwaggle. So now let's move on to another crazy legendary, not quite as absurd as the last one, but still pretty interesting. This is Grumble Worldshaker, a new Shaman legendary minion. He is a 6-mana elemental, so another tribal card. He's a 7/7, so pretty good stats for 6 mana right off the bat. That's above average stats, which is unusual for legendaries in Hearthstone. Usually they're a little understated to make up for their effects. And Grumble's effect here is a battle cry that says return other minions to your hand, and they cost 1 mana. So all of the minions on your board, you play Grumble, they are returned to your hand. These are not copies. So you actually take the minions that are on the board and you put them back in your hand as cards, but those cards are now always cost reduced to 1. So whether they were 10 mana or 2 mana, everything that you pull back is actually going to be 1 mana. So you could kind of think of this as something like Shadowcaster almost, although it's just 1 mana minions. Their stats and everything else remain intact. They're not going to get debuffed in stats like Shadowcaster. So maybe a little bit more like Shadow Step, but a guaranteed discount all the way down to 1. Now, you could also say like Youthful Brewmaster, for instance, but it doesn't have cost reduction. So it's kind of like all of those things got together and made a single card. And that is Grumble Worldshaker. So let's talk about this, right? First off, the stats are good. That's a really big point in Grumble Worldshaker's favor. Like a 6-mana 7/7 is just fine. That's good. Like that's, you know, better than Boulder Fist. And that means you're not sacrificing much to play this guy on curve. That's a really important point, number one, because this battle cry is arguably great sometimes and arguably terrible other times. So I think Blizzard really did recognize that, like, this battle cry can backfire. Most people I've seen talking about this card so far are focusing on all the upside and all the potential, but sometimes you don't want this battle cry to go off. And that means that you can't necessarily play Grumble Worldshaker when you want, and that means you're kind of limiting your options, limiting your turn, limiting your mana in some pretty unfavorable ways. So I think that Blizzard said, okay, if this battle cry backfires occasionally, we need to give this guy good stats, otherwise you may never see play. So I think that was important to balance him, because if this was just a purely good battle cry and he had these stats, clearly he might be overpowered. So the reason it's bad, right, and that's because Hearthstone is ultimately a tempo game most of the time. You want to have minions on the board, you want to have damage on the board that is ready to attack moving into your opponent's next turn. Having that initiative is incredibly valuable. So, you know, having 3 5/5s on the board is really, really good, because they can trade into stuff. And pulling those 5/5s back into your hand with Grumble Worldshaker means you're losing stats, you're sacrificing initiative. So it takes another turn to play those and another turn for those minions to gain attacking initiative. So you're really kind of slowing yourself down with Grumble Worldshaker. So the idea, clearly, is to play this with probably lower statted minions that have very powerful battle cries. Because if you can take advantage and leverage those really strong battle cries multiple times and at a huge discount in the future, then you don't necessarily mind sacrificing the stats, particularly if the stats are on the weaker side of things. So anytime you can think of a strong battlecry minion with weak stats, hey, maybe that's a fit for Grumble Worldshaker, because you don't mind sacrificing a little bit to gain a ton in the future from that super cheap Battlecry instant activation. Now, this is notably an elemental card, and a lot of people are citing that Grumble seems like a great fit in elemental decks. So, for instance, there's things like Blaze Callers and Servant of Kalamos and Kalamos, the Primal Lord himself, all of which have really strong battle cries. You know, you get to generate an elemental, you get to deal 5 damage to the board, you get to do all kinds of crazy stuff with Kalamos. And Grumble does make a little bit of sense in an elemental deck, I have to admit, because they do have those strong battle cries. The downside is, like, you know, taking a Blaze Caller off the board can be a pretty big backfire, because that's a 6/6 minion. Like, ideally, what you'd want to do is play your Blaze Caller, trade it into something so it's like a 6/1 that's super susceptible anyway, then play Grumble, then put the Blaze Caller back in your hand, and then play it for 1 mana again for that battle cry and a heal on your minions. That's like the idea. That's the dream. And I think there's some potential for that to work, I'll be honest. A 6/6 can trade into stuff. A Servant of Kalamos can occasionally trade into stuff, and you gain additional value off your Grumble. A lot of people are saying, like, this is the best legendary reveal in the set so far. This card's totally crazy. I want to dial back on that a little bit, because yes, those opportunities exist. I think this card will be played. I think it makes sense. I think it does cool things. But sometimes you just want to have the 6/6 out there to attack next turn. And maybe you have 3 minions and you're in a super winning position, and Grumble becomes a restriction or a kind of a risk to have in your deck. So I don't think this is the ultimate card, and I certainly don't think this is a card that fits in all kinds of decks. You have to have a very specific sort of deck designed to enable your Grumble Worldshaker. I don't think this is a one-of for Shaman by any means. If it works, it's probably only going to work in one deck, and even then I think it's probably like a tier 2 or tier 3 deck. I don't think this is a meta-defining tier 1 card by any means, unless somebody finds the perfect elemental Shaman list, then perhaps it could be, but I think that's rather unlikely. So, all that said, really interesting design. I think Blizzard did a good job with this card. It's cool, it's fun, it synergizes well with stuff Shaman does, it doesn't sacrifice stats. All of that's great, just not the best card in the set, but certainly a playable card, no doubt there. So up next, let's move on to a new Paladin minion. This is the Benevolent Djinn. This is a 3 mana 2/4, another little elemental here. And this one reads, at the end of your turn, restore 3 health to your hero. So this is just a nice little card, right? Like, nothing too insane here. Very reasonable stat line for its cost. The elemental tag gives this some interesting homes in an elemental style paladin deck, which we haven't seen a ton of ever before. There's been a few lists that popped up here and there, but just another nice elemental body for that potential. And Paladin does have a few different elemental cards that make sense, and a cool little effect too, right? It's essentially Friendly Bartender, but plus 1 mana and class, so you gain a little more health. I think this is a fine card. There's just really not much to say about this one. It's a pseudo-taunt against aggro decks, right? Because they have to kill the Benevolent Djinn most of the time, otherwise the health it restores is just too high. So a 2/4 taunt that also heals you 3 after you play it is pretty good. If it does go uncontested, it could heal 6, could heal 9, etc. That's great too. I do have to say though, I don't think healing is really the game plan most of the time in Hearthstone. Usually you're just happier to have a taunt on board. Like, I don't know that you'd ever want to run this over Tar Creeper, for instance. It might just save you as much or more health and trade more favorably into multiple things. So it's good. Certain decks could use it. I think it's a fine arena card. 2/4 is okay for a 3-drop in arena in particular, and sometimes that health gain can linger and help you recover games. But in Constructed, I just don't know what you play this card over, and even Tar Creeper is an elemental, so if you're playing elemental decks, do you really need the Benevolent Djinn? I'm not sure that you do. There might be some deck here or there that carves out a spot for Benevolent Djinn because it just needs that little bit of extra healing or some extra 3-drop to fill in its curve for elemental decks. But honestly, as playable and as fine and as harmless and okay as this card is, I think ultimately it probably just gets a little left behind. Not because it's fundamentally bad or anything, just because better alternatives exist and it doesn't fit any sort of specific game plan all that well. So I think a very well-designed card, once again, much like all the other cards on this list. There's just not that much to say about it because it's just okay. It's a nice little playable Hearthstone card that probably won't see all that much play. And now finally we have one last card here. This is the Druid card, Grizzled Guardian. This is an 8 mana 3/5 beast with taunt and a death rattle that reads recruit 2 minions that cost 4 or less. So first things first, its body is a 3/5 taunt. That is essentially Singe and Shieldmaster, a 4-mana basic card that's really not very good these days. Like, Sinjin has seen play in constructed format, but there are clearly better alternatives out there right now. So, you know, a 4-mana card that's average, and that means that you have to make up 4 additional mana somewhere else, right? Because this is an 8-mana card. So the Death Rattle effect has to be worth 4 mana. And presumably, if it recruits 2 minions that cost exactly 4, then you sort of have a 12-mana total value proposition here with Grizzled Guardian. If everything works out, you'd get 12 mana value for an 8-mana card. The problem with that logic is that first off, the 4 mana right off the top with Grizzled Guardian is pretty slow for an 8-mana card, and really not a very good 4-mana card at that, so you're already sacrificing a little bit. Now some people will say, but Regis, it's Druid. It's not really turn 8. You're playing it on turn 5 or turn 4, and a 3/5 on turn 4 is fine. Because all of the ramp, Regis. And my return comment to you would be, yes, but the card still costs 8, so you have to compare it to other cards that cost 8. For instance, would you really rather play a 3/5 Taunted Beast, or would you rather play Medivh on turn 8, or a Primordial Drake on turn 8? There's a lot of alternatives that also cost 8. So when I say turn 8, I don't mean literally turn 8 for Druid. I mean, it's an 8 cost card. You have to compare it to other cards in its family. So I don't think I'd ever really want to play a 3/5 Beast on turn 4 or 5. It's 8 mana. I'd rather probably play that big stuff in a ramp style deck. So this doesn't really make sense to me there. The other problem with Druid specifically and the recruit mechanic is that most of the minions you want to run in Druid that are low cost, think Mire Keepers, think Jade Spirits, there's a handful of others. I mean, even like, well, Fandral is the one example here that actually does work. But if you think Jade Spirits, you think Mire Keepers, you can think of a few more. Most of the 4 or less cost cards that we currently see in Druid simply don't work very well with Recruit because they either have a Battle Cry or a Choose One effect that is completely lost with Grizzled Guardian. You just pull a 2/3 Jade Spirit out of your deck, and that'd be terrible. Now, clearly what that means is that Grizzled Guardian wouldn't be run with those minions in its deck, but that means you're not running the most popular versions of Druid right now, by any means. So it's going to have to show up later if it ever shows up, and even then, Druid is just fundamentally a combo, or not combo, but a Choose One base deck, so most of the cards you're going to like just don't make all that much sense with Grizzled Guardian. For instance, really the best possible options with Grizzled Guardian might just be some Singe and Shieldmasters. And then you've essentially got 3 Singe and Shieldmasters. But, of course, also, you can get minions that cost less than 4, so there's some risk there as well if you run 2 or 1 cost minions. Grizzled Guardian gets even worse, so it's like, can you build a deck that only runs 4 cost or higher minions to enable Grizzled Guardian? I don't think so. So if Fandral Staghelm is the one good card in all of the game you can get off of Grizzled Guardian, that's just not strong enough of a play because your opponent dictates when Grizzled Guardian dies. They kill your Fandral, all your power level that you hope to get off Fandral is lost. I could keep going on and on about Grizzled Guardian, but basically what it all boils down to is this card's a little bit too slow. This card's a little bit too risky, with most of its value being tied into a Death Rattle that can backfire on itself, but can also just be silenced off and ignored and so on and so forth by your opponent. And that there are just so many better options out there to play in a Druid that needs to play 8 mana things. I mean, honestly, Ironbark Protector might just be better than Grizzled Guardian, and that's a basic classic card. This one just doesn't work for me at all. I don't see any way to leverage this for some sort of crazy combo. It doesn't make sense in late game value ramp style decks. It's not enough tempo. It's not enough defensive power. Grizzled Guardian, it's just fundamentally failing as far as I'm concerned. And there you go, guys. That wraps it up for my detailed reviews of those 4 cards. What I'd like to do next is jump into my quick reviews where I rate each of these cards from 1 to 5 stars. Temporus is a 3-star card. King Togwaggle is a 1-star card. Grumble Worldshaker is a 3-star card. Benevolent Djinn is a 2-star card. And Grizzled Guardian is a 1-star card. And there you go, that wraps it up for part 6 here. I just don't even know what to say. King Togwaggle, Temporus, really even Grumble are all just kind of totally wildly absurd. I can't wait to get my hands on these cards. I don't really think they're going to be all that good on average, but Hearthstone is certainly going to be enjoyable and it's going to be fun. So I'm curious what you guys think. Are you happy to see these sort of fun meme-style cards? Do you wish they were a little bit more competitively viable? Maybe you think they are competitively viable after all. In any case, I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave those in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.